have to hit the magic 100. It's coming on rapidly. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our lecture. We are very lucky today to have Dr. Bangul from the Department of Political Science to give a lecture on Prince. I know my students are excited about this. Dr. Bangul got his BA from the University of Alberta, his MPhil from the University of Oxford, and his PhD from the University of Toronto. And we are very lucky to have him this afternoon, and I will now hand the Zoom over to Dr. Bangul.
Well, thanks, Chris, for the introduction, and Katie for organizing the lecture. It really is my pleasure to be here, and I always enjoy being able to contribute to the honor sequence in the small ways that I can. Typically, I'll give the lecture on post-Republican fall and this lecture on Machiavelli's Prince in the spring. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I have a PowerPoint that I want to use for your benefit. So let's see if I can do this. For some reason, I'm having a little bit of a technical glitch here. I'm going to have to leave the meeting and come back in order to share my screen.
Okay, no worries. We will hold down the fort, and I'm just going to remind everybody to stay muted until the end of the lecture. So don't mind me if I end up muting you if you do not mute yourself.
Okay, I'm back. All right, so I'm just going to share my screen here because I want to see. Here we go. Okay.
Beautiful.
There we are. Okay. So here we go. So as the translator of the edition of The Prince that I believe you were assigned to read for this week observes in his introduction, I actually studied with Harvey Mansfield at one point for a postdoc. He's an interesting character. But in any case, as he observes in his introduction, he who picks up The Prince of Machiavelli holds in his hands the most famous book on politics ever written. But it's perhaps better to speak of the book's infamy, because Machiavelli has things to say in this book that prevented its publication until he was cold and dead in the ground. And almost as soon as The Prince did appear in print, it earned its author a place upon the list of forbidden writers kept by the Catholic Church, as well as an enduring reputation as the teacher of evil. And it's not hard to see why. The Prince is written as a weapon. Its intended victim is the traditional view that politics ought to be subordinate to morality. So morality demands that we practice justice, right? The virtue of serving the common good. But Machiavelli argues that in politics, justice can become self-destructive. It can undermine the common good. Paradoxically then, the things we normally condemn as unjust and evil can, in the circumstances of politics, become necessary and even justified. Or so Machiavelli argues. Injustice can become justice. Evil can become good. But Machiavelli sees that accepting such a topsy-turvy idea is simply beyond most people. It seems so obvious that politics is dysfunctional because politicians aren't serious enough about morality and justice. But common sense couldn't be more wrong in this regard, according to Machiavelli. Politics so often fails to deliver, not because virtuous leaders are so rare. It fails because even vicious leaders are more attached to virtue than it seems, to others and even to themselves. At least some of us, preferably leaders themselves, need to learn why that is and how and when to throw off moral duty more strategically and completely, Machiavelli argues. So one needs to become comfortable with what is otherwise shocking and contemptible. And it's in this spirit that Machiavelli calmly recounts for us episodes like the one about Cesare Borgia in Prince chapter 7. So Cesare, he was the son of Pope Alexander VI, and he was more commonly known as Duke Valentino. And Machiavelli begins his account of Cesare by explaining how he brought law and order to the Italian province of Romagna, which had long been plagued by criminal gangs and popular unrest. So if you have your Prince with you, read along with me this passage. This is on page 29, about 2/3 of the way down the page. Cesare, Machiavelli writes, found it had been commanded, that is Romagna, the province of Romagna, by impotent lords, who had been readier to despoil their subjects than to correct them, and had given their subjects matter for disunion, not for union. Since that province was quite full of robberies, quarrels, and every other kind of insolence, he, Cesare, judged it necessary to give it good government if he wanted to reduce it to peace and obedience to a kingly arm. So, what did he do? He put there Messer Ramiro de Orco, a cruel and ready man, to whom he gave the fullest power. In a short time, Ramiro reduced it to peace and unity, with the very greatest reputation for himself. In other words, that's a euphemism I've never heard of. Ramiro did some nasty stuff. Then the Duke judged, that is Cesare Borgia, Duke Valentino, he judged that such excessive authority was not necessary, because he feared it might become hateful. Skipping a few sentences here, he says, and because he knew that past rigors, again a euphemism, past rigors had generated some hatred for Ramiro, his deputy, who did all these nasty things, to purge the spirits of that people and to gain them entirely to himself, Cesare wished to show that if any cruelty had been committed, this had not come from him, but from the harsh nature of his minister. And having seized this opportunity, he had him, that is his minister Ramiro de Orco, placed one morning in the piazza at Cassina, in 2 pieces, with a piece of wood and a bloody knife beside him. The ferocity of this spectacle left the people at once satisfied and stupefied. So Machiavelli's endorsement of such violent spectacles naturally invites outrage among pious people. But the dark truth behind these stories is that the actions they report do effectively achieve their purpose. Cesare Borgia terrified the gangsters and mobs of Romagna into peaceful obedience, and he did so without incurring the hatred of the people. But this he accomplished only by using his deputy, Ramiro de Orco, so ferociously and manipulatively. In other words, Cesare knew how and when to break the rules of conventional morality to further his own selfish goals. And in doing so, he brought peace to a people previously harassed by criminals and riots. Now, before exploring these ideas any further, it's important to step back and address Machiavelli's historical context and cultural legacy. So for Machiavelli, he's among the most important figures in the history of political thought. In fact, among political theorists, he's considered the intellectual and even spiritual kind of founder of what we call modernity. So the cultural ethos of the modern world has some of its deepest roots in the ideas that Machiavelli was the first to grasp and to publish. Now, it may seem strange to say that Machiavelli was the founder of modernity, given that Machiavelli lived during the Italian Renaissance, because everyday language sort of equates modernity with now, with our own immediate historical period. But as unique as our own times may seem, they reflect deeper attitudes that have characterized Western societies for several hundred years. We have much more in common with the generation of George Washington than Washington had with the generation of Machiavelli, despite being separated from each other by roughly the same amount of time. And that's because a hallmark of our own way of thinking, and of Washington's way of thinking, required a profound intellectual and spiritual rupture. And in Europe, this rupture occurred in the 15th and 16th centuries in the wake of Machiavelli's writing. It represents a break with a tendency stretching back into the furthest reaches of recorded history. So what I'm talking about is this, that until the Renaissance, human life was dominated by a certain resignation. So people generally believed that the future could never exceed or be better than the past because of natural limits to human power. But during the Renaissance, this politics of resignation was challenged by thinkers like Machiavelli. Such thinkers held that the moderns, as they called themselves, can become stronger than the ancients, more capable of asserting themselves upon nature. And this is the optimistic belief that distinguishes modernity. To be modern is to think that the future can exceed the past. It is to believe in progress. And it is to think this, it is to believe in progress, on the grounds that the men of the past were too respectful of nature, too modest about their own capabilities, and above all, too sincere in their commitment to traditional altruistic morality. Of course, there's a certain irony in saying that modernity began with the Renaissance. For Renaissance literally means rebirth, specifically of the learning of ancient Greece and Rome. And this rebirth originated in a renewed respect for classical antiquity, for the distant pagan past. It called for the imitation of classical models, especially in the liberal arts, and it spoke of the present with disrespect. So on the surface, the Renaissance appears to be the very opposite of modernity. As we're going to see, Machiavelli was very much against the Renaissance, so understood. Rather than seek to bring the past back to life, Machiavelli sought to overcome the past altogether. He teaches not simply that we ought to revive classical wisdom, but that we ought to make bold new discoveries ourselves. Now, Machiavelli's project was so successful that many of us now take progress for granted. We unthinkingly assume that the present is decisively different from and better than the past. In other words, we are modern. We are modern now. Not merely in the sense that we live in modern times, but in as much as we believe our times to be exceptional. And this belief is hard to avoid because of how profoundly human life itself seems to have changed since the dawn of modernity. Just consider the visibility of technical knowledge and its power over nature. Right? So since the 15th century, the moderns have discovered the means to dominate and manipulate nature in ever more radical ways. Modern technology has become capable of utterly transforming not only the Earth's physical landscapes, but even the chemistry of its oceans, the composition of its atmosphere, and the genetic codes of living organisms. But if you put yourselves in the shoes of Machiavelli's contemporaries, the people of his day, it's not hard to see why they would reject the notion that the present would be fundamentally better than the past. To people of his day, the possibility of progress was controversial. After all, who are we to do differently what our fathers have always done? And who are we to change what the very gods have enjoined us to do? So says traditional thinking. And aside from these traditional objections to progress, there was also the simple fact that two traditional societies, nature appeared very resistant to human control. So before modern science and technology, human life was brutally vulnerable. Every day, children would die of disease, parents would die of famine, soldiers would die of war. And political life in particular seems naturally limited by certain
students very excited about this.
The good and the
Dr.
virtuous
Bangle
appear
got
to
his
suffer
BA
just as much, if not more, than the bad and the
University
vicious.
of
And the people, the
Alberta,
men,
his
they appear to be hopelessly
MPhil
confused by and attached to
from the
mythical things.
University of
Consider, for example, how
Oxford
political life is represented in Plato's
and his
Republic. If you remember from last
PhD
semester.
from
In
the
Plato's view,
University of
political life is
Toronto.
cake. It's full of shadow-like myths and ideologies
We are very
to which
lucky to
people are
have him
attached, like
this
prisoners or slaves,
afternoon,
clapped in
and I will
chains.
now hand
Political
the
life is also
Zoom
limited
over
by certain
to
unsolvable
Dr.
problems of Plato,
Bangle.
not least the problem of justice on which he focuses in the Republic.
Well, thanks, Chris, for the introduction and Katie
So to
for
see what
organizing
Machiavelli's
the
doing in Prince, it's
lecture.
actually helpful to contrast his argument with
It
the
really is my
Republic in a little
pleasure to
more
be here. And
So here's a
I
brief
always
reminder of the
enjoy,
problem that the Republic is dedicated
being
to.
able to contribute to the honors sequence.
Despite what we would like to think, there is a deep and
in
abiding
the
tension
small
between
ways that I
justice on the one hand and
Typically,
happiness.
I'll give the
That's
lecture
because
on
whatever else
the
it is,
Republic in the fall.
justice is dedication to
This
the
lecture on
common good of the
Machiavelli's Prince in the spring.
But happiness,
So I'm going to go ahead and share
my
things
like power,
screen because I have a PowerPoint
So to rigorously practice justice, therefore seems to imply leading a life of unhappiness.
that I want
Conversely, a life that
to
is happy seems to imply practicing injustice, acquiring
use
good things
for your
oneself and others.
benefit.
Now, the Republic might imagine how this problem could be solved, but as you saw in the fall, Plato casts doubt on the likelihood of success. He suggests that the problem of justice can be solved only for an exceptional sort of person, namely someone like Socrates, whose happiness is found in tenacious pursuit of the truth, something that can be held in common. And for the rest of us, being just depends on believing what Plato notoriously calls noble lies. And these are myths that teach that justice itself is the best way of getting the things conventionally associated with happiness. Such teachings are myths or lies because justice often requires sacrificing the things associated conventionally with happiness. So in this way, Plato teaches that we can't expect too much from politics. Politics is by nature just beset by certain problems, not least the problem that the virtue on which
For some
politics
reason-
depends above all, justice, comes at the expense of the happiness that most people seek.
I'm having a little bit
Machiavelli
of technical
instigates a
glitch
radical
here.
break with this attitude of
I
resignation.
might have to leave the meeting and
And
come
he does
back
so by
in order
redefining
to
the
share my
common good at which
screen.
justice aims.
Okay.
Oh,
No
So rather than think of
worries.
variance by the highest and fairest way of life, we should take as given the things that most people selfishly desire.
We will hold down
As he
the
boldly
fort,
announces in chapter 3 of the
and
Prince,
I'm just
quote,
going to remind
"It is a very
everybody to
natural and
stay
ordinary thing
muted
to want
until
to
the end
acquire.
of the lecture. So
Tradition had
don't
placed
mind
limits
me
on
if I
condemned
end up
acquisitiveness
muting
or greediness,
you.
covetousness.
if
But Machiavelli
you
argues
do
that
not
such
mute
efforts are
yourself.
self-defeating. It's human nature to be greedy for glory and to long to rule others. At best, suppressing such desires gives us a bad conscience. At worst, he argues, it deprives us of the happiness that we all seek. The common good is therefore not to be found in overcoming natural selfishness. It is to be found in fulfilling that selfishness more effectively. If we work with the natural impulses of most people rather than against those impulses, then we might allow more people to get more of what they really want. And it's this idea that is the germ or seed of modernity. Emancipate greedy selfishness rather than suppress it.
Okay.
And then harness the
I'm
greater
back.
needs that people pursue for good.
All right.
For Machiavelli, that means
So-
collectivizing selfishness and then turning it on foreign powers. So rather than tyrannize your own
I'm
neighbors,
just trying to share my
Machiavelli urges us to recruit our neighbors
screen
in tyrannizing.
So I want.
And so Machiavelli becomes the first political philosopher to recommend
Here we go.
imperialism as the solution to the fundamental human problem.
Beautiful.
There we are.
Now, on a first reading, such ideas
Okay.
repel many readers, obviously.
So
before
here we
dismissing
go.
Machiavelli as evil, it's worth considering why he thought himself the greatest of
So
men.
as the translator
Machiavelli
of
sees himself as the
the
fountain
edition
of
of
a
the
radically new
Prince,
orientation towards nature.
I
and the overall
believe
context
you
of human
were assigned to read for this
And that's
week,
because before Machiavelli,
observes
that's what I'm alluding
in
to before,
his
people looked at nature
introduction.
as
Actually
mysterious,
studied
but
with
reassuringly providential.
Harvey Mansfield at one
Right? So
point
people suppose that human
for a
life proceeds in
postdoc.
the grips of forces beyond our control.
He's an
and that ultimately
interesting
reward
character.
those who diligently
But in any
pursue
case,
virtues.
as he observes in
This idea
his
dovetails with
introduction,
that the world is ruled by gods whose purposes aren't always clear, but who demand
he who
obedience and
picks
humility
up
of human beings.
the Prince of
To the ancient
Machiavelli
Romans, this twofold character of
holds
nature
in
was
his
worshipped as the goddess
hands
Fortuna. But there's a sense in
the
which all
most
spiritual science
famous
worship
book
nature
on
is something both
politics
mysterious
ever
and
written.
beneficent, so long as we show the natural order.
But it's perhaps
Machiavelli
better to
famously
speak of
challenges
the
this
books
attitude toward nature and
in
Fortuna.
because
Nature
Machiavelli
is
has
totally
things to
indifferent
say
human
in this
purposes,
book
especially on
that
justice.
prevented its
It neither rewards
publication
virtue
until
nor
he
punishes
was
vice,
cold
at
and
least not as
dead
these
in the
moral powers
ground.
were traditionally understood.
And
Imagining
almost
that
as
nature does
soon
that,
as
act
the
of
Prince
is
did
like relying
appear
on
in
blind
print,
chance.
it
Time and
earned
again,
its
we see Machiavelli harshly
author
blame princes or
a
rulers.
place
for this very
upon the list of forbidden
Instead,
writers kept by
Machiavelli
the
argues
Catholic
that man
Church,
makes his own luck.
as well as an
He suggests that
enduring
luck or fortune is simply
reputation
the name that
as
we assign
the
to forces we
teacher
don't
of
yet
evil.
understand. Rather than humbly accept,
And it's not
what we
hard to
don't
see
understand,
why.
we should adopt a much
The
more hopeful and
Prince is
progressive
written
posture
as a
towards the context of our
weapon.
lives, he suggests. We
Its
can and should
intended
learn about them,
victim
not to serve moral
is
purposes
the
that we project in,
traditional
but to
view that
subordinate to our
politics
more urgent needs and
ought to be subordinate
In other words, human
to
beings can
morality.
gratify our appetites more reliably than we ever dared to suppose. If only
So
we have the
morality
audacity to
demands that
demystify
we
nature
practice
and to tame it.
justice.
So nature is not
Right?
mysterious
The
or providential
virtue
or
of
beneficent.
serving the common
It is
good.
knowable but coldly indifferent to us.
But Machiavelli
It is not emotional.
argues that in
And it's in
politics,
this sense that
justice
Machiavelli
can
inaugurates the
become
project of harnessing nature through science and
self-destructive.
technology. All with a
It
view to serving
can
human needs and
undermine
happiness.
the common good.
To be sure, he merely lays the foundations for his work.
Paradoxically,
He leaves his
then,
successors like Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke.
the
to work out
things
the
we
full implications
normally
of his idea.
condemn as
Domesticates
unjust
the
and
bloodthirsty character.
evil can, in the
But Machiavelli,
circumstances
to
of
whom all those luminaries I just
politics,
mentioned looked in their own
become
philosophical projects.
necessary and even
And this aspect of nature,
justified.
it was the one that Machiavelli
Or
is
so
most interested in himself.
Machiavelli argues.
It flows from the traditional view that nature is
Injustice
providential.
can
So
become
Machiavelli wants to challenge the idea that the world consistently
evil
rewards
can
acts of
become
kindness and
good.
generosity, and that those who do best are those who show greatest humility, and greatest piety, and greatest respect.
But Machiavelli
He wants to
sees
say, no, they are not
that
necessarily the ones who do best. In fact,
accepting
the world
such a
is worse.
topsy-turvy
And the key to starting
idea
down this road
is simply beyond
is
most people.
recognizing the necessity of what men
It
have
seems
traditionally
so
condemned.
obvious that politics is
So
dysfunctional
his idea is
because politicians aren't serious
justice and
enough
other moral virtues can
about
become
morality
self-destructive,
and justice.
particularly in the circumstances of politics. Because in
But
politics,
common
especially among
sense
nations
couldn't
and
be
empires,
more
good
wrong in
guys
this
finish last,
regard.
and all who depend on
according
good
to
guys suffer the
Machiavelli.
consequences of their finishing last. And that's because in
Politics
foreign
so
affairs,
often fails
there's no
to
criminal law
deliver,
enforced by state power.
not
So
because
within each
virtuous
state, those who
leaders
hurt
are
others
so
or
rare.
morally, they are ultimately caught and punished.
It
But when
fails
it's the
because
state itself
even
that acts,
vicious
the economy of
leaders
rewards and punishments is
are
very different.
more
So
attached
foreign
to
affairs,
virtue
it's much easier to practice
than
injustice
it
with impunity,
seems
and
to
much riskier
others
to
and even
practice
to
virtue.
themselves.
The prince or ruler who scrupulously observes moral rules
At
simply
least
invites the
some
exploitation
of
of
us,
unscrupulous rivals.
preferably leaders
The prince who refuses to
themselves,
break promises
need
choose
to
violence against
learn
his
why that is
will be outmaneuvered by
and
those who are
how
willing
and when to throw
Whereas in,
off moral
private life,
duty
the
more
consequences of laying
strategically
chunk
and
are confined to the
completely.
private person and his family.
Machiavelli
In
argues.
public life, those consequences
So
may
one
have
needs to
detriment or even the
become
destruction of the community itself.
comfortable
Because in these
with
cases,
what is
or
otherwise
as a result, in these cases,
shocking and
Machiavelli says that good becomes evil and justice becomes injustice.
And it's in this spirit that
We
Machiavelli
means is
commonly
respecting the
recounts
rules
for us
in these cases.
episodes
not
like
to
the one
triumph of the
about
common good, but to
Cesare Borgia.
So
in
this is
Prince
why it's so
chapter
important to
7.
Machiavelli that we be less respectful of nature
So
and the moral rules that nature is
Cesare,
created to support.
he was the son of
It's
Pope
by learning to be
Alexander
less respectful of
VI,
its rules that princes
and
can
he
lead
was
their
more
peoples
commonly
greater
known
stability,
as
peace,
Duke
prosperity, and
Valentino.
glory.
And
It's by
Machiavelli
blindly respecting
begins
moral rules that
his
princes are led to
account
the
of
ruin of themselves and
Cesare
countries.
by explaining how he brought law and order to the Italian province
So at this point, I think I'm just going to
Romagna,
pause, and
which
I
had
want to see
long
if you have
been
any
plagued by
questions
criminal
before I proceed.
gangs and popular unrest.
So I'm just going to open
So if you have your prints with
the
you,
window here.
read
So
along
if you have a question,
with me.
Yeah, put it in the chat. That's a good idea.
This passage. This is on
So
page
Pippin has a question.
29.
Machiavelli's attitudes about relative morality and
about
power
two-thirds
seem to challenge the
of the way
ideas
down
of the church.
page.
Did conflict arise from this? Yes, absolutely.
Cesare
So-
Machiavelli
And yes, these slides will be available.
found it had been commanded
Yeah, so
that
Machiavelli,
Romagna,
part of
the
the
province
sort of
of
infamously,
Romagna,
part of his purpose in the
by
prince
impotent
is,
lords
to attack the
who had
authority
been
of the
readier
Catholic
to
Church.
despoil
He's
their
writing this.
subjects
The prince, he wrote this 15 years before his death,
and had
published
given
in
their
30,
subjects
you know,
matter
in
for
the
disunion,
throes of
not
the first phase of the
freedom.
Reformation. So the Catholic Church is already
Since
on its
that
heels.
province was quite full of
But Machiavelli,
robberies,
yeah, I mean, he's
quarrels,
a
and
thoroughgoing
every other
critic
kind
of
of
the Christian religion.
insolence.
And
He,
his criticisms are
Cesare,
pretty,
judged
the church
it
itself is pretty
necessary
concealed.
to give it good
But it's not
government
hard
if
to
he
sort of
wanted
connect the
to
dots.
reduce it to
It's not part of
peace
the
and obedience
focus
to
of
King
Mark
Leonard.
here. I'll allude to it as we go along.
So,
it's certainly a major theme in the book.
he put there
and in his political philosophy.
Mr. Ramiro de
Oh,
Orfeo,
and okay, so Connor asked, did Machiavelli's torture influence his writing? Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up.
to whom
So,
he gave the fullest
you reckon
power.
Machiavelli was famously tortured
In a
by
short
the
time,
Medici rulers of
Ramiro
Florence,
reduced it
having
to
served,
peace and
Machiavelli
unity
served,
with the very greatest
republic that had
reputation for
been
himself.
reborn in Florence for a brief period at the end of at the end of the 15th century. And when the Medici came back to power, he was
Ramiro
arrested and tortured.
did some nasty stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, so some people thought that
Then
he
the
wrote the
Duke
Prince,
judged,
dedicates it to
that is Cesare
the lesser
Borgia,
Lorenzo
Duke of
Medici. And some
He
people thought
judged
he
that
sort of wins
such
back to the
excessive
Medici family.
authority was not
My own view is that his ambition,
because he feared it might
and in fact,
become
I think when read carefully, the dedication
Skipping
is actually sort of
a few
a
sentences
nasty
here,
joke that
he
Lorenzo's expense.
And because he
It takes
knew
kind of a while
that
to
past
unpack that word, but
rigors,
if you take the introductory political theory,
past rigors had generated some
okay, and
hatred
Britain asked,
for
can you expand
Ramiro,
on the list of forbidden
his
writers?
deputy, who
What
did
was
all these
what was it?
nasty
What did it
things.
mean to be honored?
To purge
yeah, so,
the spirits
the Catholic
of
Church
that
exercised
people and
a
to
kind
gain
of,
them entirely to
censorship,
himself.
for
Cesare
hundreds of
wished to
years.
show that if any cruelty had been committed, this had not
if someone
come
published
from
something
him, but from the
that the
harsh
church
nature of
authorities
his
deemed
ministry.
excessively inconsistent with
And having
Orthodox
seized this
doctrine,
opportunity,
it would be placed
he
on
had
a ban.
him,
It would be placed under a ban.
that is his ministry.
And you could be persecuted for circulating such writings. So Machiavelli publishes this book, which is like a bombshell, right? Like it's just the stuff he's calling for, both implicitly and explicitly, just couldn't be more contrary to much of the teaching of the Orthodox teachings of the Catholic Church. So the prince ends up. This is part of why he published it posthumously after he died, because he knew if he published it in his lifetime, he would immediately be persecuted even more than he already was. Good questions. Okay, I'll go back to the slides now. We'll pause maybe again to take some more questions as we go here. Okay, let's see. So I'm going to now kind of walk us through a few specific chapters of the Prince and see how Machiavelli's kind of finer grained discussion of various themes illustrates these kind of broader ambitions that I was talking about before. So chapters 8 and 9 of the Prince, they nicely illustrate Machiavelli's teaching about the necessity of evil, or what he here calls cruelty. So these chapters treat of apparently opposite ways in which a prince might come to power, what Machiavelli calls the mode of crime and the mode of popular support. So at this point, he's actually followed the table of contents of chapter 1. So chapter 1 is kind of a table of contents. And to this point in the Prince, he's kind of followed that table of contents. Right? So he's discussed different ways of becoming a prince or a ruler, different ways of coming to power. And in particular, he's discussed two ways, right? Coming to power by fortune or through reliance on others, and coming to power by virtue or through reliance on oneself. Now, however, in chapter 8, he writes of coming to power by means of crime. And crime doesn't seem to fit into either category, right? Into either fortune or virtue. So this obviously raises the question, is Machiavelli abandoning the distinction with which he began between acquiring power by fortune or acquiring by virtue? It would be odd if he was abandoning this distinction, seeing as he stressed the profound importance of it and will continue doing so. So he's claimed that fortune and virtue are mutually exclusive. They are the only paths leading to political power. But acquiring power through crime doesn't appear to be a case of either fortune or virtue. So what's going on? And we can make sense of what Machiavelli's doing here by noticing what he implies. Namely, that coming to power by means of crime is part of what it means to acquire power by means of virtue. Crime, well used, turns out to be a key element of virtue for him. How the heck does that work, right? Well, consider Machiavelli's premier example in this chapter, Agathocles of Syracuse. So Agathocles rose from the peasant class of ancient Syracuse, which is a great ancient Greek city on the island of Sicily. Agathocles rose from its kind of lower class to become its tyrant. And he did so by butchering the entire ruling elite. And this brutal deed eliminated at a stroke the only possible rivals to Agathocles' power, according to Machiavelli, who is not above giving it his wholehearted endorsement. And yet, he says on page 35, quote, one cannot call it virtue to kill one's citizens, to betray one's friends, to be without faith, without mercy, without religion. Now, some readers have thought that this statement shows that Machiavelli remains anchored in a traditional view of virtue, despite all that he says to the contrary. But consider this. What is Machiavelli's only criticism of Agathocles? Notice that Machiavelli does not criticize Agathocles for being wicked. He criticizes him for allowing himself to be thought wicked. Agathocles failed to develop a personal mythology that might have cleansed the memory of his cruel deed and have secured for him a good name. So Agathocles then was effectively cruel, but neglected what Machiavelli calls spiritual arms. So he neglected to take control of the way in which his actions would be interpreted and remembered. He didn't develop a mythology or found a religion, which the greatest political leaders always use to their own advantage, or so Machiavelli argues. Agathocles then can't be said to have acquired his state through virtue, but not because he was morally corrupt. His lack of virtue was betrayed in allowing himself to be thought corrupt and remembered for being corrupt. So what is Machiavelli implying about virtue and vice here? Like, how do we usually think of these terms? We normally think of virtue as excellence of character, where good character leads to the doing of good deeds. And traditionally, good deeds are those that help others without necessarily helping ourselves. But Machiavelli radically redefines the things the virtuous person does. For him, virtuous deeds are those that help leaders get what they want without being hated. They're actions that put leaders in control of their own fate. And by that definition, things like cruelty and violence, condemned by traditional morality, may become virtuous under the right circumstances. Now, Machiavelli anticipates the objection that everyone always has to this, which is that cruelty is simply ineffective or counterproductive, and that the success of leaders can't be attributed to their criminality. But he meets this objection by distinguishing between kinds of cruelty. So he allows that many cruel deeds are gratuitously sadistic and useless. Men like Agathocles, however, know how to use cruelty effectively, with the result that they are the leaders who are often more humane. So upon acquiring power, he observes, it's necessary to secure yourself against potential rivals. You have to give offense, to use his language. And if those rivals are prepared to use lethal force, even if they appear friendly and supportive, one must preemptively use such force against them. One must use cruelty. But Machiavelli observes that those too squeamish to face up to this fact are either destroyed, or they are simply forced to draw out the necessary crimes and offenses to secure themselves. So better by far to use cruelty well, all at once, at the outset of one's acquisition of power, which then releases the prince from the need to keep on killing. And it's this observation that brilliantly muddies the waters, because it suggests that it's actually more humane to do all the dirty work at a stroke in one tremendous spurt of cruelty. The thought here is sort of like, if one's injured dog is going to die, better put him out of his misery than to draw out his suffering. And Machiavelli, in making this point about politics, he forces us to concede some significant moral ground. Because in everyday life, cruelty is just bad. But if Machiavelli's right, then acting on this belief in political life either spells one's doom or forces the prince to commit unnecessary cruelties. And that's surely the bigger evil, isn't it? But if this is really what Machiavelli's on about, then why does he say what he means in such an ambiguous, roundabout way? This is another question people often have about what's going on. Right? I would suggest that Machiavelli wants to make it as easy as possible to internalize what is otherwise a shocking and radical teaching. So he's happy to shock his readers, of course, but he's aware that most of them believe that conventional morality ought to be observed, even if they don't always live up to that belief themselves. So to be taken seriously by such people, Machiavelli must at least pay lip service to our pious beliefs, even as he works persistently to undermine them. And this is ultimately why he begins chapter 8 by sustaining the distinction between crime and virtue. In the next chapter, chapter 9, Machiavelli moves from acquiring a principality through crime to acquiring through popular support. In other words, he moves from the least to the most respectable means of coming to power. And here the argument is that it is better to become prince with the help of the people than with the aid of the great or the nobles. In arguing as much, Machiavelli is the first major political philosopher to endorse the building of the regime or political community around the preferences and prejudices of the people. So in this sense, he's the first democratic political philosopher. But as with so much else in Machiavelli, there is a darkness beneath this otherwise respectable argument. So how does this argument work? How does Machiavelli defend the need to build on the people, not the great? Well, the answer depends on distinguishing what he calls the two humors or moods of a regime. So on the one hand, he claims that the humor of the people is merely to be left alone, to be free from domination, and to be secure in their small properties. But on the other hand, there's the great, the richer, better educated class, who have a reasonable expectation of sharing in power. And their characteristic humor is to desire more than security, right? They equate their dignity with domination, not being free from it. So the great are therefore rivals to a new ruler in ways that the people are not. They desire power for themselves as a means to dominate the people. The great therefore not only imperil a ruler's power directly, they will be satisfied only by rendering the people unsatisfied, by preying on the many and thereby inciting the many to revolt. Now, why is this a problem? Well, popular dissatisfaction threatens the ruler's power from within. It also leaves the state vulnerable to invasion from without. Whereas Machiavelli makes clear in this in subsequent chapters, the people are the backbone of the state's capacity to project its power. A loyal, disciplined, belligerent people is the most secure foundation for a prince's power. And the people's loyalty depends on satisfying its characteristic humor, keeping them free from domination by the great. So it seems that every ruler faces a dilemma. Satisfy the people at the expense of the great, those who are in the best position to plot against and depose you, or satisfy the great at the expense of the people, thereby leaving the state itself vulnerable to revolution and foreign conquest. But as with so many problems and dilemmas that Machiavelli raises in The Prince and in all his writings, he has an ace up his sleeve. So rulers, he says, who want to be secure in their power must slaughter the great, liquidate them, just as the criminal Agathocles had done to the Syracusan aristocrats. True, rulers always need deputies. They can't be everywhere at once, and they require others to do their dirty work. In this sense, a prince does have to depend on the great. But Machiavelli observes that the loyalty of deputies can be secured by ensuring that they owe their positions to the ruler himself. So a ruler of virtue, in this new Machiavellian sense, does not look upon an aristocratic order as a kind of natural, inviolable institution. Rather, he recognizes that the great can be made and unmade. Eminent men can have their titles revoked and property seized, and commoners can be elevated to positions of rank. Best of all, he says, is to acquire the state with the support of the great, on the promise that you'll let them have their way with the people, and then to eliminate the great altogether in a bloody spectacle. That way, one can remake the great from scratch, awarding the titles and property stolen from the previous elite to a handful of common men who seem most meritorious. And this stratagem has several advantages. First, it not only engenders gratitude in the new elite, it also terrifies them to obedience and loyalty. It says, better not cross me. Just look what I did to the last guys. Second, because the prince initially appeared to be against the people now feel more obligated to him, now that he has unexpectedly released them from their oppressors. So what's the overall takeaway here? Well, it's better to found one's power on the support of the people rather than on the loyalty of the great, because one needs the people more than the great. But a prince cannot allow the people to recognize this dependency. One must be as independent as possible even if only appearances. And happily for rulers, most people mistake appearances for reality. Ultimately, then, there's no difference between coming to power through crime and coming to power with the people's support, between the least and the most respectable modes of acquisition. What works is knowing how to manipulate human psychology, deceive and destroy the great in order to deceive and be supported by the people. Okay, Augusta asks, so would you say that the overall goal in terms of cruelty is to maintain the image that you are not cruel? Does Machiavelli support/disapprove taking ownership of any actions that could be deemed as cruel? So here, you have to remember examples like Agathocles or Cesare Borgia, right? So clearly Machiavelli thinks that a reputation for cruelty can be advantageous to a ruler, provided it doesn't make him hated. So he thinks that you can be feared without being hated. And I'm actually going to come, he dwells on this a bit in chapter 17, and I think we're going to have time to talk about that in a moment. So kind of stay tuned for that, for how that works, okay? So let's now jump to chapter 15, which begins the cycle of chapters with which the prince is most often associated, and for good reason. To this point, Machiavelli has had plenty of shocking things to say, but he's been careful to impart his most shocking teachings as half-veiled insinuations. He hasn't come right out and said that virtues and vices, religion and God, are best understood as political tools to be used strategically in the service of a leader's ambition. With chapter 15, however, he begins a section in which he will bring these shocking ideas right to the surface. So Machiavelli starts by calling himself presumptuous, by which he means disrespectful of tradition and traditional thinking. In being presumptuous, Machiavelli's following his own advice. He's embracing the disrespect with which he's been reading the Chronicles of Great Men, and indeed embracing the disrespect for tradition that he claims such men practice themselves. Acquiring and maintaining great power, the men stepping outside of the behavior deemed acceptable by custom and conventional norms. And this is as true for Machiavelli's own project as it is for the princes of whom he discusses. But Machiavelli knows that these demands are extremely difficult to accept. Only the most audacious and ambitious person could possibly face up to them. And he admits as much by claiming that his intent is to write something useful, not just to anyone, but to whoever actually understands it. That is, to whoever is capable of following Machiavelli's clues to see the full scope of his shocking view, and who is then prepared to coolly accept that view and not simply reject it out of sort of moralistic revulsion. In the same passage at the beginning of chapter 15, he clarifies what he means by useful. For those readers who know how to connect his dots, he claims to, quote, go directly to the effectual truth of the thing, and not to dawdle with the imagination of it. And it's precisely this, he adds, that distinguishes him from all his predecessors, all the philosophers of old who wrote about the political things. His point here is that the criterion of truth is effectiveness. The measure of the truth is its effects. So the truths that should interest us are those that help us get what we want, that produce the desired results. And here it's worth pausing, I think, because it's a mark of just how successful Machiavelli's project has been, that we now take this criterion of truth for granted, I think, in sort of popular culture. Because we often hear the complaint about academia, that it is an ivory tower where scholars concern themselves with merely theoretical understanding. And indeed, this is precisely how many scholars proceed, very much in the spirit of the tradition that went before Machiavelli. It was in the spirit that Plato wrote dialogues, for example, not to change the world, not to equip others with the tools to do so, but just to help readers grasp the nature of the world, just for the sake of understanding and contemplating it. But we latter-day Machiavellians have a hard time with theoretical wisdom and contemplation for its own sake. We are impatient for truths that work. We assume that people should be more concerned with knowledge that is effectual, in the sense that it can be used to acquire or change things. And we suppose that truth should not be pursued for its own sake. We assume that knowledge is for the sake of action, for the sake of power, in fact. And that, I submit, is one of Machiavelli's most enduring legacies. Nowhere is the modern Machiavellian view of truth more apparent than in the impatience with utopianism. Plato and Aristotle felt obliged to discuss utopias, but neither thought that the impracticality of a utopia undermined its goodness. But to Machiavelli, goodness like truth is what works. So impracticality is, in his view, a decisive objection. And indeed, thinking of an impractical regime as best, according to Machiavelli, is dangerous. As he writes here in chapter 15, concern with theoretical truth is the ruin of political men. It tempts a person into acting as though he lived under the orders of the utopia, not under those of the real world. In the real world, people are vicious. As Machiavelli will claim in chapter 17, quote, one can say this generally of men, that they are ungrateful, fickle, pretenders and dissemblers, evaders of danger, eager for gain. In a word, people are untrustworthy. Perhaps they could be trusted if we lived in one of the imaginary republics of the philosophers. But since we live in real republics, we must live with real and therefore untrustworthy men. In fact, he says, quote, it is so far from how one lives to how one should live, that he who lets go of what is done for the sake of what should be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. For a man who wants to make a profession of good in all regards must come to ruin among so many who are not good. That's why it's necessary to a prince, he concludes, quote, if he wants to maintain himself, to learn to be able not to be good, and to use this and not use it according to necessity. In saying this, Machiavelli begins the radical reassessment of the traditional virtues that will be the theme of the next few chapters. The point is not merely that those virtues are good in themselves, but that regretfully, their observance is sometimes bad. That's a common misreading, I think. Rather, the point is that the traditional virtues and vices are misnamed, at least if virtue is supposed to be good for the virtuous person. To actually have the traditional virtues is good, Machiavelli wants to say, only to the extent that they contribute to security, well-being, and fame, the things that every ruler wants. What is good is what gratifies the desires we naturally have, not those we ought to have. So traditional virtues that would make it impossible for the use of cruelty, deception, or violence would to that extent compromise security and well-being. So, according to the reasoning of chapter 15, certain qualities that seem to be virtues, such as generosity and fidelity and mercy and faith, can sometimes become vices. And certain so-called vices, such as cruelty and pride and dishonesty, can become virtues. And even Machiavellian virtues, they're not ends in themselves, as the traditional virtues were thought to be. No quality is absolutely or simply good in his view. The key is psychological flexibility. As he said at the end of that first paragraph of chapter 15, knowing how to be good and not be good as necessity demands, and knowing how to switch back and forth. That's what matters. That's what counts. Now, in the ensuing chapters, there's sort of examples of why scrupulous adherence to the traditional virtues is counterproductive. And first up is liberality, or as we would say, generosity, the virtue of giving. Machiavelli begins by acknowledging the traditional view that such virtues are inherently good. But he immediately raises the concern that practicing generosity threatens the reputation for being generous. Being generous, or being liberal, invites the hatred and contempt of the people. Why? Because being generous or liberal presupposes having something to give. But where to get it? Even if you come to power wealthy men, giving generously can quickly exhaust your resources. In which case, you would either have to rob the people themselves in order to give back to them, or cease giving to them altogether. And either way, you lose the reputation for liberality or generosity with which you began, and you make yourself hateful. You also make yourself contemptible by becoming poor. An impoverished ruler has a hard time making himself appear powerful and frightening. So even if you had practically limitless resources and could sustain your spending spree indefinitely, doing so would only render your rule vulnerable, because the people would expect your generosity to continue, and anyone who could force you to stop giving could pull your state out from under your feet. So what does Machiavelli recommend instead of liberality? Well, at first he says the better course is simply to accept from the beginning a reputation for stinginess, or what he calls meanness or parsimony. That way, you neither have to rob the people of their property nor frustrate their expectations of gifts. In fact, since the people expect nothing from a miserly, parsimonious ruler, they're much more grateful whenever he does bestow gifts on them. And since parsimony is not among the qualities that undermines a ruler's authority with the people, it's better to practice this vice than to observe its corresponding virtue. But so far in this chapter, Machiavelli's assumed that government revenues are limited. If there were no means of expanding the supply of wealth, parsimony would be best. But on page 64, he lets us in on a better, even nastier strategy. It turns out that a ruler can avoid contempt and hatred while being thought liberal at the same time. How? By making war upon the neighbors, rapaciously stealing their property, and redistributing the loot among one's own citizens. The lesson? Liberality is not really a virtue because it does nothing to help a ruler or state acquire and maintain the good things. Rather, where imperialism is impossible, the so-called vice of parsimony becomes a virtue. And where imperialism is possible, then it is the even more vicious quality of rapacity that is called for. Only in practicing that rapacity can a ruler be thought liberal without destroying himself. Okay, what about the virtue of mercy? Can a ruler succeed while being merciful? Notice the translator, Harvey Mansfield's note at the bottom of page 65. The word translated as mercy is pietas in the Latin of the chapter's title. All of the chapter titles in Machiavelli's works are in Latin, even though the text itself is in Italian. So pietas can be construed as mercy, but it can also mean pity and compassion, or even piety and faith. And accordingly, mercy is the virtue most closely associated with Christianity. So the subject of chapter 17 then is whether a ruler can be a pious Christian and still succeed. But for understandable reasons, Machiavelli doesn't draw that connection explicitly. What is his answer to this question? Well, he begins with a paradoxical observation that mercy and pity presuppose cruelty and violence. So just as the ruler who would be liberal must end up robbing the people to whom he wanted to be generous, so the ruler who would be merciful and kind must end up being unnecessarily cruel. So mercy or piety invites more cruelty than is strictly necessary. His point is not that rulers should practice cruelty just indiscriminately. Rather, he maintains that it is in the best interests of both ruler and ruled that the ruler face up to the necessity of cruelty used intelligently. So here he asks us to contrast the actions of our old friend Cesare Borgia with those of the Florentines, the people of Florence. So remember Cesare, the guy who had his vicious deputy Ramiro de Orco dismembered in the Piazza of Cassina. Well, those sorts of deeds, Machiavelli tells us, were spectacularly successful at pacifying Romagna, a province that had previously been dogged by crime and violence. Cesare knew how to use cruelty in a measured, intelligent way, with the result that less cruelty was visited on the people of Romagna than would otherwise have been the case. By contrast, Machiavelli asks us to consider how the Florentines proceeded in their management of Pistoia, a city then subject to their power. Out of a desire to escape a name for cruelty, he says, the Florentines allowed Pistoia to be destroyed by factional disputes and riots. Or for a more familiar example, consider the disastrous policy of appeasement pursued by the Western powers of Nazi Germany prior to the Second World War. The point is that, once again, traditional virtue invites the predation of less scrupulous men. And while the consequences of being preyed on in private life are harsh, they're much harsher when visited on an entire people, which is what happens when it's rulers who allow themselves to be exploited. What is more, since mercy or pity is most closely associated with Christian virtue, the implication is that a ruler who scrupulously adheres to the moral strictures of that faith will bring about the undoing of himself and his state. This point leads Machiavelli to another. He now asks the question for which the prince is most famous. Is it better to be feared or loved? Well, common sense suggests that those who love us are the most trustworthy. But chapter 17 is perhaps the nastiest and most honest account of human nature in the whole work. In general, Machiavelli tells us men are wicked. They are capable of gratitude and virtue only when it suits them. But when times are hard and frightening, when the conflict between virtue and the good things becomes most stark, most people will look out for themselves. Virtue teaches that we owe help to those we love, which men are happy to offer when the conditions are right. But when offering help requires overcoming great fear, love just doesn't cut it, he says. To rely on love for loyalty is therefore to rely on chance, on fortune. Better to rely on the thing over which one can have more control. Better to make those upon whom one depends more fearful of oneself than of whatever it is that would frighten them out of their loyalty. better than to use cruelty and the threat of punishment than rely on love. Notice that Christianity represents a great obstacle to this teaching. Christianity assimilates the good to love. Anyone persuaded by its moral vision thus invites exploitation and disaster. Mercy, for instance, is a species of love, the antithesis of which is cruelty. So to think of love as the good is to think it wise to abstain from cruelty. But if Machiavelli is right, doing that is self-destructive. One must break some eggs to make an omelet. Similarly, to think love a reliable foundation for trust is to make a fundamental mistake about human psychology. Relying on others' affection will make it impossible to depend on their support when it matters most, when something frightens the loyalty out of your erstwhile supporters. Okay, any more questions at this point?
I put a question in the chat like 15, 20 minutes ago. Still curious about it.
If you want, Tobin, yeah, I can read your question out loud. So Tobin asks, which more modern infamous leaders would Machiavelli admire? If that's a question you can answer.
Yeah, I mean, lots of people have written about this, right? So, like, what would Machiavelli think of Vladimir Putin or, Hitler or Stalin or any of the sort of notorious totalitarian leaders? I mean, I think typically, like in the case of totalitarianism, what sort of happened is that the logic that he's working on has changed. Like, so I think what's happened is Machiavelli didn't foresee the full unfolding of modern society that he triggered and helped start. So for him, he thinks that if you equip political rulers with the audacity and the prudence and cleverness and psychological flexibility to project power more efficiently, then all the people over whom those leaders rule will benefit in a kind of basic, their humor, the humor of the people to be free from domination, be satisfied. Because he teaches that your power as a ruler is built on ensuring that the people don't feel dominated. So insofar as a ruler's own self-interest has been decoupled from respecting that humor of the people, Machiavelli's teaching no longer works, I would say. Right, so these totalitarian leaders clearly they're not satisfying the humor of their peoples typically, which makes their rule unstable. It's imprudent, but it's also, but insofar as it works, that attests to how something's changed that Machiavelli didn't anticipate. That would be. There's lots else to say about that, I guess, but I think I'd leave it there. Okay, so we got a few other questions here. So Britton asked, would you consider the prince to be a countercultural on purpose? Yeah. I mean, it's both. So yes, definitely. Like Machiavelli thinks that the prevailing the authority that Christianity has and the view that politics ought to be subordinate to morality, the authority that view has is a problem for politics, and it's a problem for everyone who depends on the success of their leaders. So he wants to undermine that view, and also he wants to undermine the authority of Christianity, I think. So in that sense, he's radically countercultural. But like I've said a few times, he sees that a kind of direct frontal assault on prevailing moral orthodoxy, at least Christian orthodoxy, is probably not going to get him very far. So he gives himself plausible deniability. On the other hand, though, I do think that he expected that his book, that it would be pretty transparently anti-Christian, and that its great interest would actually be in offering political leaders something that they couldn't refuse, right? A kind of a way of sort of rationalizing what it is that their conscience had blamed them for wanting. And Machiavelli sort of gives them a way of clearing their conscience, and he thinks that will both benefit those leaders and also all the people who depend on them. Okay, I'll take more questions at the end. I have one more slide I want to take us through, right? These are great questions, though. Super interesting. Okay. Let's see here. So the penultimate chapter of The Prince. Here, Machiavelli focuses on the theme of fortune. And it's in this chapter that he directly shows the implications of his teaching about good and evil for the destiny of humankind. It's here that he anticipates the technological domination of nature that has become so familiar to the modern world. And he begins with a meditation on an all too human flaw, inclining us to misperceive what fortune really is. So men wrongly suppose that because something has happened in the past, we can therefore count on it continuing to happen in the future. So it's for this reason that men suppose, quote, that worldly things are so governed by fortune and by God that men cannot correct them with their prudence. That's on page 98. In other words, human beings infer from the observation that things have always happened in a certain way that we are powerless to push things in new directions. So from continuity, we infer fatalism. But this inference is one that Machiavelli urges us to reject. And to see why, we need to consider the difference between fortune and God, the two things to which he draws our attention in the first sentence of this chapter. Now, what might be the difference between a world ruled by fortune and a world ruled by God? At least the Christian God. Well, wouldn't a world ruled by fortune be one ruled by something capricious and indifferent to our fates as human beings? After all, fortune is the personification of blind chance. What does chance give a damn about our fate, right? On the other hand, wouldn't a world ruled by God be a place ruled by benevolent providence, one in which everything works out for the best? It turns out then that believing fortune and God rule the world, as men are liable to do, is to believe contradictory things. What's more, it only makes sense to be fatalistic if it's God who's in charge, right? If it's an all-powerful, loving God who rules the world, then it makes sense to go with the flow. Because in that case, our lives could be in no better hands. Certainly, we wouldn't be better off in our own hands. But if fortune rules the world, then we might well wish to rule ourselves instead. Fortune is something we should want to oppose, not accept and submit to. So where does Machiavelli come down to this question, right? These two things turn out to be mutually inconsistent. Is the world ruled by God or by fortune? Notice that in the chapter title, Machiavelli mentions fortune, but not God. And later in the chapter, quote, so that our free will not be eliminated, he claims that fortune is the arbiter of half our actions, leaving the other half up to us. So in saying as much, Machiavelli seems to be preserving the Orthodox Catholic doctrine of free will. But notice that he's done so without preserving God. For if the world is wholly divided between fortune and man, then God is dropped out of the picture. So fortune, not God, governs our actions, but in a way supportive of human control. After all, from a non-Christian point of view, the replacement of God by fortune represents definite progress. Why? Well, the Christian God is omnipotent. Human freedom depends on his goodwill, on a specific use of his power. But Machiavelli presents the fortune with which he replaces God as possessing only half the power over what goes on in the world. In a godless world, human freedom exists in its own right, dependent only on humanity itself, which is just as well. For if fortune is the personification of blind chance, then we should want to minimize its power. So this then raises the question that the chapter itself explicitly asks: how far can fortune really be opposed? Now, Machiavelli appears to think that fortune simply governs half our actions. But how does that work? Like, how does Machiavelli explain the role of fortune in human life? Well, look at if you have your book with you, look at page 98. Follow along. I'm going to read this passage. It's worth reading. This is what he says. I liken her, this fortune, to one of those violent rivers which, when they become enraged, flood the plains, ruin the trees and the buildings, lift the earth from this part, drop in another. Each person flees before them. Everyone yields to their impetus without being able to hinder them in any regard. And although they are like this, it is not as if men, when times are quiet, could not provide for them with dikes and dams, so that when they arise later, as these floods, either they go by a canal, or their impetus is neither so wanton nor so damaging. It happens similarly with fortune, which demonstrates her power where virtue has not been put in order to resist her, and therefore turns her impetus where she knows the dams and dikes have not been made to contain her. And if you consider Italy, which is the seat of these variations, and that which has given them motion, there's been all sorts of political floods in Italy in this period, you will see a country without dams and without any dike. If it had been diked by suitable virtue, like Germany, Spain, and France, either this flood would not have brought the great variations it has, or it would not have come here at all. So what is Machiavelli saying here? Is it his point that fortune rules man only where man fails to set his house in order? Conversely, isn't Machiavelli implying that where man does set his house in order, he rules fortune? Isn't he implying that in principle, man can conquer fortune? The point is that human power is limited, not by fortune nor by God, but by the belief in fortune or in God. This belief is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Our belief in our weakness makes us weak. Our belief in the existence of insuperable obstacles to our power is itself the greatest obstacle to our power. It makes us both complacent and negligent. In this way, Machiavelli opens the door to the prospect of a vast conquest, the only obstacle to which is human ignorance. So in this way, he foresees not merely the conquest of cities and countries by armies and soldiers, directed by the special sort of political prudence that he teaches, but he also foresees the conquest of the natural forces, otherwise indifferent to human beings. In principle, the conquest of fortune is possible. In practice, however, a certain crucial problem emerges. What stands in the way is the natural fixedness of men's dispositions. So some are naturally cautious, others naturally impetuous or audacious, and each succeeds or fails depending on whether his disposition fits with the times, Machiavelli says. So if you look at the top of page 100 in this chapter, this is what he writes. For if one governs himself with caution and patience, and the times and affairs turn in such a way that his government is good, he comes out happy. But if the times and affairs change, he's ruined because he does not change his mode of proceeding. Nor may a man be found so prudent as to know how to accommodate himself to this, whether because he cannot deviate from what nature inclines him to, or also because, when one is always flourished by walking on one path, he cannot be persuaded to depart from it. And so the cautious man, when it is time to come to impetuosity, does not know how to do it, hence comes to ruin. For if he would change his nature with the times and with affairs, his fortune would not change. So the problem of overcoming fortune proves in the end to be that of overcoming human nature, of achieving a flexibility which we do not possess by nature. In other words, man must conquer himself in order to conquer fortune. Even naturally audacious or impetuous men are too conservative or cautious, inasmuch as they don't know how to stop being audacious. And this would seem to explain Machiavelli's puzzling and shocking praise of audacity over caution at the very end of the chapter, after he's explained the problem of fixed dispositions. Here he calls for a new kind of audacity, one that rejects natural audacity as too rigid. Men must dare to change. They must become resourceful, flexible, adaptable. He's referring back to that psychological flexibility that he introduced back in chapter 15, knowing how to be good and not be good as necessity demands. And there's a kind of audacity and impetuosity that sort of flexibility requires, right? Being so audacious that you know why it's necessary and you know how to throw off your own audacious personality. You develop such a broad personality that you can strategically use the dispositions or traits that other men find themselves fixed within. And the way he portrays this, though, it becomes this really enduring and notorious imagery, because, of course, he represents this teaching in this brutal imagery of the violation of fortune, who he describes as welcoming that assault, that she looks kindly on those who force themselves upon her. And that image of humanity forcing itself on her, or even raping nature and fortune, has this tremendous enduring quality in the rise of modern science and technology, which is built on this aspiration to conquer and control and harness natural forces that we previously looked on with kind of reverence and respect. And like I said at the beginning, that attitude, as much trouble as we're running into with it now, that attitude originates in, or at least in part, to a great extent, in Machiavelli, and here in this chapter 25 of the Prince. So I will conclude the lecture there. I'll stop the screen share here. And hi, everybody. So I don't know if we have any time left for any more questions. I'm happy to discuss this stuff some more. Yeah, I wasn't sure how late I can keep you.
Yeah, I think we did have a pretty significant drop off of participants as it's 5 p.m. But if students have, I think Britton may have another question that he posed in the chat. But yeah, we Tuesday morning,
Half at 5. Yeah, okay, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you know what? I'll say this, guys. If you have more questions about Machiavelli, feel free to send me an email about it, or you can come see me in my office on campus. I have office hours Thursday and Friday afternoons between 1 and 2:30, and you can feel free to drop in. My office is just on the ground floor of Stevens Hall. If you look up my website on the Department of Political Science page, you'll be able to find where I am.
That's
Robert, thanks so much. That was an excellent lecture and so many points for us to discuss. I can't wait to get back into my preceptorial.
Awesome. Well, you're very welcome, guys. Like I said, it was my pleasure. And I hope to keep doing this for you guys in the future. So.
Great.
Thank
Thanks a
you.
lot.
Yeah, so appreciated. Yeah, I think I'm gonna stop recording and then wish everyone a great Tuesday night.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks again.